In this lesson titled Moving, Copying, and Inserting Data, we're in Workbook Lesson 05, Layout Features, and we're currently in Worksheet titled Move, Copy, Insert. Often, we need to move our data around in our worksheet. We learned earlier that we could insert columns and rows, and that is very useful. And a lot of times we combine these two ideas in order to move our data around. For instance, we might decide that we really like this title right here. It's the months from January to June with total average, but it needs to be up here in row 1. Well, the first thing you might think to do is, well, I'm going to right click on my 1 row header and choose Insert to make room for it, and then I can move that up here, and that's very true. Let's do that. Let's click and select all of this. Several ways I can do this. The easiest way is just simply put my cursor over the border, anywhere on the border, and I can just simply drag it and release, and by default it moves it. And when I say move, I mean it's no longer here. This is blank. It's not a copy. It's now up here. So that worked very well. But we might decide later that really we didn't want to drop down this other information an entire row. We wanted it to stay on row 1. We just simply wanted to move this data down. So let's click undo here, Control Z and Control Z again, and look at another thing we could do. We could also move all of this data out of the way first. So I could select all of this and then just put my cursor here. And I can pull this down and decide maybe I even want it over a little further to the right, so it starts in the B column. And I release, and now my data is here. And now I could select this data, this title bar, and I can move it into where I want it here. So move is extremely useful. I was able to move all of this around, and I was able to leave this other data untouched over here. I didn't need to add any rows or columns here and keep this intact. So whether you're moving in a single item, a single cell, or moving several cells across a row or across a column, it's very easy just to click and drag. You also can use some other shortcut keys. Let me clean up this data right here with a best fit between B and C. I'm going to double click, and that will fix that. So if we wanted to copy this information right here, we can also use shortcut keys, Control X for cut, and then I place my cursor here, and Control V for paste. So that was another way of moving, by cutting and pasting. I'll hit Control Z to move that back, and then double click over here to undo that. Now let's take a look at copying versus moving information around. We've decided that we want to put some more data down below. We want to use this exact same title bar up here that has our months and total and average. And we want to make a copy of it. Well, it's the same as moving, only you hold down your control key. So after I click and start dragging, I hold down my control key, and I will get a little plus symbol next to my cursor. And when I release my mouse, I get a copy of that information. So anything you want to copy, you can just simply select the cell, you can drag, and while you're dragging, you can hold down the control key and just release your mouse first, and then you'll get that information. This was based on a formula, so when I tried to copy the formula no longer works. So if you look here up in your formula bar, you'll see that that's a formula I copied versus just some regular data. And so because it's a relative formula, it's trying to pull information from over here, which it can't. So that's a really good point about what you copy and paste. If it's a formula, you may get something a little more unpredictable. But if it was just regular data, like right here, I'm going to click and drag on its border and keep the control key down so that that's a copy. And I click that in there, and we can see I copied that 100 from here to there. So there's some ideas for how to copy data. Let's delete this data here. Now let's take a look at inserting data, and that's a little different. Let's scroll over here to the right, and we see some information here. And let's talk a little bit about inserting. Inserting can be extremely useful when we just simply want to switch the data. I want Sam's information to be where Loenfeld's information is. So what I can do is just select it as if I was going to move it or copy it. And again, we drag this bar right here. We click on one of the borders and we drag it to move it to where we want it. And this time I'm going to hold down my Shift key. And when I do, I get an insert bar. And that insert bar is going to tell me where I'm going to be inserting the information. So I'm going to just put it right here and then release with my mouse. And you can see we actually switched the information. Because I inserted it, it had to shift the other information. So I didn't copy over it. Let's try that again. If I was to select all of Sam, and if I was to click and drag without holding down the Shift, and I let go of it, it would give me this warning. There's already data there. Do you want to replace it? If I said OK, it would move my data here, but it's going to delete what it went on top of, and of course it's going to leave this blank up here. So holding down the Shift actually moves the data, but it inserts it so the other information shifts around to fill in the gap. So inserting is a very useful tool, especially if you're doing like an entire row or an entire column, because if you're inserting just a few items, it can mix things up. Let me hit Control-Z to undo that. So now let's look at a few other options you have for inserting. On this row here where we have Sam and this information, if I was to click and drag with my other mouse button, so that's the right mouse button versus the normal left mouse button, if I click and drag with that, I get a regular move box. This looks like it's going to move or maybe copy the information. But when I release it, I actually get lots of options. One way to remember this is that the right mouse button is typically involved with options, like you right-click on a header for a column or a row to get some choices, or you right-click on any cell and you get some options for that cell, what you can do there. So if you drag information with the right mouse button, you get all of these options. I can move it here, copy it here. I can copy just the values only. I can copy the format. I can link it here. I can hyperlink it here. And I get an option like this one, which is Shift down and move. And this is kind of like our insert option. I'm going to select that. So you can see it actually shift down, and then it kind of moved everything else out of the way. It was kind of like clicking and dragging with our Shift key down for inserting. So lots of options when you move something, but you move it with the right mouse button. Important to remember that. One more thing before we finish. We can also move an entire column to change its order. So let's do a column here. So let's decide that we want to see the base salary before the commission. Well, I can simply select all of this information right here, and I can click over here, and I can drag it over, but I'm now going to hold down my Shift key before I release, and I want to make sure my cursor is right between two columns or close to a column so it knows that this is a column move, and release with my mouse first. And because the Shift key was down, it did an insert and it moved commission over. So now I see the base salary and now I see the commission. So it's important to remember that we can do all of this column information as well. What about moving an entire column, not just a selection in there? Can I grab an entire column and just move it over? No, if I click and try to move, it's just doing a selection, isn't it? But if I use, for instance, a column header to select all of the entire column, now I can click here and I can move it over. So this is just going to be a move. I haven't used any of my other keys. I'm going to hold down the Shift key to make this an insert here. And I can insert that over. Now this did the entire column all the way down to over 1 million rows. So you can make very large selections before you move, copy, or insert.